Good evening and welcome to today's panel discussion entitled Israel in the ICJ, What Next? My name is Farah Kutene and I'll be chairing this panel discussion on behalf of the Palestinian Return Center. أهلا وسهلا بكم في أسبوع العودة الذي يستضيفه مركز العودة الفلسطيني في London. During this evening's panel discussion, we'll be hearing from our esteemed panel of speakers who will be delving in depth into South Africa's current case of genocide against Israel in the International Court of Justice, the history of the ICJ, its strengths and its limitations, and what possible outcomes could come from South Africa's case. Before introducing our speakers, I just wanted to mention there'll be a Q&A after both of our speakers have spoken. And if we have time, we'll try to get through everyone's questions. So please do comment your questions in the YouTube and Facebook comment section. Thank you. So our first speaker of this evening is Mr. Richard Falk. He is a leading international law professor, prominent activist, prolific author, and a pioneer thinker dedicated to peace and justice. During 40 years at Princeton University, he was active in seeking an end to the Vietnam War, a better understanding of Iran, a just solution for Palestine and Israel, and improved democracy elsewhere. He also served as UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestine. Since 2009, he has been nominated annually for the Nobel Peace Prize. Over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be on this important panel. Let me start by saying that the interim order issued by the International Court of Justice on January 26th in response to the South African initiative taken under Article 9 of the Genocide Convention, entitling any party to that convention to bring a legal dispute before the ICJ. What is most notable is that the provisional measures requested by South Africa to attempt to halt the genocidal onslaught on Gaza resulted in a near unanimous judgment by the court, not of genocide and not ordering a ceasefire, but taking major steps to halt the genocidal violence that Israel has been engaged in the past 4+ months. As expected, Israel repudiated the decision, and actually ministers called it a typical expression of an anti-Semitic court, which is a rather absurd insult. What is significant is that the court probably reached a historic high in fulfilling the expectations that law, not national allegiance, would be the determinant of how it decides controversial cases. Many were surprised, and I confess that I was somewhat happily surprised that even the American president of the court agreed with the South African request for provisional measures and read aloud the interim order. What is significant is, on the one hand, the court did exactly what it is expected to do. It upheld a clear case of violating the most fundamental rules of international law to the extent that a preliminary order uh, empowered it to do. This order, though, was dependent on its implementation, and that's where the limits of the ICJ arise. It can declare the law, but it has no capability to enforce the law. And that depends on the Security Council, where the 5 permanent members have a veto power, and the United States has shown no reluctance to exercise that veto power. Israel, in one of the provisional orders, Israel was instructed to report on its compliance with the other 5. And apparently it has submitted a undisclosed report that is allegedly very sparse and probably cannot in any serious way purport to accept compliance by Israel with what the provisional measures ordered, including the abandonment of genocidal language, the failure to pursue any kind of actions that were genocidal, the obligation to preserve evidence of existing genocide. So the court has come to do what it was expected and hoped it would do when it was established back in 1945. But what it can't do, as I've suggested, are 2 things. It can't implement its own decisions, and it is bound by a legal process that will take it several years, in all probability, judging from past performance, to reach a substantive conclusion on the fundamental South African complaint that Israel is guilty of violating the Genocide Convention in its prosecution of a military campaign in Gaza, which is itself problematic because Israel is the occupying power and has no rights of self-defense in such a situation. So that these 2 limitations on the court's authority are fundamental. No capacity to enforce, and a delay that makes the eventual judgment of academic interest, but probably not relevant to the behavior at issue. So it raises the question, is international law irrelevant in such a situation if it can't be enforced and if a timely decision cannot be reached? And I would maintain the argument that it is substantively handicapped by these 2 major constraints. At the same time, it contributes to the symbolic role of international law as legitimating civil society activism and serving as an impetus for the further mobilization of solidarity initiatives, arms embargo, sanctions, and boycotts of all kinds, including cultural boycotts and sports boycotts. It also raises the pressure on the governments that are complicit at this point with Israel, including the major liberal democracies of the West, to respect their own internal public opinion and abandon this posture of assisting a country that is engaging in what has been called the most transparent genocide in human history, that is enacted before the eyes and ears of the world in real time. So the role of international law in this symbolic domain has an enormous effect on public opinion, which in turn can alter the substantive outcome of conflicts. We should remember that in the context of the anti-colonial wars of recent decades, the side that had the national liberation side that had the inferior military capabilities, yet it was able to win the war partly because it enjoyed the symbolic support of international law, which led to this formidable solidarity initiatives and pressure on the colonial powers to abandon their colonial possessions. I would maintain that there is this potential inherent in the ICJ proceedings up to this point. Let me stop there and await the contributions of other panelists.
Thank you very much, Richard. We're going to go on to our next speaker of the evening. Our next speaker is Muhammad Ayash. He is the author of A Hermeneutics of Violence. He was born and raised in Silwan in Jerusalem, Al-Quds, before immigrating to Canada, where he is now a professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. He recently finished writing another book on settler colonial sovereignty and decolonial sovereignties in Palestine, Israel. Over to you, Muhammad.
Thanks very much, Farah, and a pleasure to be here tonight and sharing this panel with Professor Falk. And thanks to everyone who's listening. Obviously, Professor Falk has all the expertise on international law, so I don't have much to add to what he already said about the hearings and the case that the South African state has brought to the ICJ. How I will talk about it is to kind of pick up where Professor Falk left off. As a scholar of social movements, a scholar of political violence, and a scholar activist myself, in terms of what we can do with this. To me, I always situate the question of international law and cases like this brought to such a court. I always situate it within the grassroots activism of people. To me, it's undeniable from my perspective that if it wasn't for the resistance of the Palestinian people on the ground in Palestine, if it wasn't for example, journalists, Palestinian journalists in Gaza or in the West Bank or in Jerusalem or elsewhere, and activists sharing with the world videos and commentary on what was happening and what is happening on the ground, and the Palestinian people's refusal to submit to Israeli domination, then there wouldn't have been these worldwide protests for Palestine. And conversely, if these worldwide protests don't happen, I'm not so sure that South Africa dedicates this much effort and this much time working behind the scenes for a very long time before they came public and said, we're bringing this case. It's not like the day they said we're bringing this case was the first day they thought of it. They clearly had been working on it behind the scenes for quite some time, dedicating significant resources, I would say, into making this case happen, preparing for the backlash from the Americans. You know, South Africa, as good as the minister Pandor is, and many of the people working in that government, I don't know that they would do all of that if the Palestinian people themselves were not resisting their domination. If the Palestinian people were not calling on people across the world to stand with them and show their solidarity with their cause. So to me, it always goes back to that. That's the source of all of these processes that happen at the international level. It goes back to Palestinian resistance and the grassroots support for Palestinian resistance across the world. You know, of course, like huge protests in the UK, in the US, in Canada, in Yemen, in Kuala Lumpur, in you know, across in Turkey, across the world. All of these had a significant impact on the fact that this was taken to the court in the first place. And the case itself, you know, was quite. It was a very like an emotional moment and an important moment for a lot of Palestinians and their supporters, but especially for Palestinians. I've said this before, I'll say it again. That was the first time I've heard a non-Palestinian give our case the way exactly how we would give it ourselves at such an institution. I'm not saying that people before that have not done that in books or in speeches or something like that. Of course, other non-Palestinians have done that before in those kinds of settings, but not at an international court of justice case. You know, I'm listening to the South African case and I'm going, I have nothing to add. This is exactly how I would have liked it to see, how I would have liked it to be delivered. So even just that alone has its impact as well for people on the ground. And look, I mean, we know that the power structure that is determined to prevent Palestinians from achieving their freedom and liberation is quite strong. It is guided by the US. The US is the central player in this. It's not just Israel. Without the US, none of this is happening. The US knows exactly what the Israeli state is doing. They knew exactly that this was going to be a genocidal operation. We called it a genocide. You know, many scholars and activists, and of course, in the protests across the world, people were using the term genocide from October. Right, like so the Americans knew exactly what was going on, and they still know what exactly is going on, and they're still actively supporting it and enabling it and participating in it. So we know the power structures that we're up against is not a small one. It is the power structure of our times, of our lives, and the International Court of Justice is not going to be able on its own to bring down that power structure. It can't. It's not structured to do that because it is part of the American imperial dominance that has shaped much of this world order since World War II. But that doesn't mean that people within those structures can't also participate in opposition to it. Like Professor Falk, I was very concerned that the president of the court was an American, not just an American, but someone that came through the State Department, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, there was still the disappointing part of not calling for the ceasefire. I know there's legal arguments around all that, but I wanted all of the requests that South Africa made to be accepted. and that ceasefire was one of them. So they should have accepted that as well. But at any rate, there's an opening there now where people on the ground, we can use some of the material that comes out of these hearings, and not just the genocide case, but the hearings that just ended on Israel's illegal occupation, permanent occupation, which is at its foundation a settler colonial form of occupation. So I encourage all activists to understand that it's your work that led to this point, and it's going to have to be your work that takes it forward. So it is incumbent on all of us now, in whatever way we can, to use these decisions by the court, these cases that are brought forward into the court, to use that in order to push for economic boycott, cultural boycott, to ask for sanctions, trade embargoes in general, but we can start with low-hanging fruit in terms of arms embargoes, because ultimately there are only two ways out of this. One is genocide and war. I don't want that. The majority of people don't want that. There's only one alternative to that: economic, political, and legal isolation of the Israeli state, and if possible as well, the American empire. And really isolating the Israeli state and handing the US empire a defeat in that regard will weaken the US empire too. So it's one and the same thing. So we now take these and make it more difficult for countries to do business with Israel. So, you know, if you're a legal scholar or lawyer, do your thing. take your governments to court, just like they did in Holland, and make it harder for the government to sell arms or equipment that can be used in the weapons that the Israeli state is unleashing on the stateless Palestinian people. If you're a scholar like myself, push as best as you can. I know it's an uphill battle, but we keep pushing as best as we can for boycott of Israeli universities. If you're an artist, you know, you're working within the cultural arena, etc., etc. If you're a consumer, which we all are, stop buying Israeli goods. That's a simple one. Join the BDS campaign in terms of keeping track of what's being, you know, focused on at any particular moment. When it comes to BDS, I know a lot of people go, well, there's a lot to boycott. I don't know where to start, or it's just too much, so I better not do any boycotts. It doesn't work that way. Just because there are a lot of items to boycott doesn't mean that you can't help the focus on the few companies that the BDS campaign is telling you to focus on. So everybody right now should be not eating at McDonald's. It's good for your health too to not eat there. Starbucks, you know, the list is found on the BDS website. So the whole point of it is to continue to place pressure on the Israeli state. Without that kind of pressure, they will never change. They've had over 75 years to change. They haven't. This is the path that they have chosen, the path of genocide and war. To get off of that, we have to force them to change, and that can only come through, like I said, political, economic, and legal isolation. So I view this case at the ICJ as a contributing element to this larger campaign of putting pressure on the Israeli state. The ruling is going to come down. I don't know when. Certainly for the ICJ hearings about the question of occupation, that should come in the summer. I mean, if the court doesn't rule that it is illegal, then the court loses all its whatever credibility it has, however little that is, among people across the world. I would be shocked if they ruled that way, considering how strong the case was, how many countries came forward and put the case forward quite aggressively, quite honestly, quite openly, challenging the US, challenging Israel in a very strong way. I'm hopeful that they will rule in the right direction here and rule in accordance with reality and justice. I hope that the law catches up with justice. And we take that as an opportunity to continue to place pressure on the Israeli state and continue to place pressure on this imperial system. You know, so one of the things that Professor Falk talked about is the American veto power. More people. I am encouraged to see more and more people from across the world. The global South has always raised these questions, and I do see them as always coming and being strongest in the global South. But many in the global North are also frustrated with the system. Are also asking questions like, why does the U.S. have a veto power? Why does any country have a veto power? We should be talking about some really important transformations of these systems as well. Democratizing these international institutions where nobody has a veto power like that. And there are a number of ways you can try to organize it where it doesn't become, a place where there's just dreadlock all the time. Like, so, we can get into that if people like, but and there's people better placed than me to talk about that. But there must be better ways forward than the current system where American imperial power decides who gets to live and die, which is what they're doing right now in Palestine. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. I'm going to bring back Richard back into the conversation so we can have a brief Q&A. So one reoccurring question I saw on YouTube was, so this is a question, pose it to both Mohammed and Richard. Besides the ICJ, are there any other international legal bodies that could possibly seek justice and accountability for what we are currently witnessing in Gaza?
Shall I try, Farah, to
Please
respond? There is the option of universal jurisdiction, which enables a national court to entertain complaints about violations of international law within its scope of legal authority. Mohammed referred to the recent Dutch case, which ordered the Dutch government to no longer supply parts to certain weapon systems in Israel, and was, again, not only substantively important, but symbolically important. Whether that does more than shape public opinion is an open question. And I completely agree with what Mohammed said, in particular, the idea that Palestinian resistance has been fundamental to the willingness of governments to have recourse to these international institutions. In other words, South Africa would not have acted in a political vacuum if there hadn't been Palestinian resistance and grassroots activism. And it's, in a way, a sad commentary that it was only South Africa that initially took this initiative, given the clarity of what Israel was doing in Gaza, and given the overtness of the Israeli leadership in dehumanizing the Palestinian people and preparing the anti-human justification for their annihilation, even though they were civilians under international law, were an occupied people entitled to the protection of the occupying power, not to this kind of brutalizing devastation that is unprecedented in modern history. And even, we should remember that even the Holocaust was only understood after the fact, in retrospect, this is the first genocide that has been assaulting the people of the world in real time through the imagery, and as again Mohammed very correctly pointed out, through the activism of Palestinians that induced journalists to report through imagery and commentary on the terrible abuses of international humanitarian law that were occurring on a daily, indeed an hourly basis. The one other point, the reference to the second case, the case about the illegality of prolonged occupation of occupied Palestine, that case comes from the General Assembly and only produces, in technical international law terms, an advisory opinion, which means that it doesn't really have the force of law, and as Israel again demonstrated, was not prepared to accept the ruling in 2004 about the unlawfulness of its separation wall being constructed on occupied Palestinian territory. So again, it has this symbolic importance that I wouldn't underestimate, but it is in a different category than the South African initiative, which supposedly produces an enforceable decision and obliges the governments of the world to implement it. And final point is that we should remember that after World War II, this imperial US-led system that replaced, in a way, European colonialism, as noted again by Mohammed, that this system designed the UN to be weak. The veto power makes no sense if one's interested in a law-governed world to exempt the 5 most powerful countries in 1945 from obligations to uphold the charter whenever it clashed with their strategic interests. That was a deliberate effort to say that we accord primacy to geopolitics. International law is for the weak, geopolitics is for the strong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in terms of the question itself that was asked, I don't really have any insight into that in terms of other legal bodies. I think Professor Falk captured that there. But yeah, just to go on what we just said, you know, and again, I am focused much more on the symbolic significance of these of both hearings. One of the things that did stand out to me more in the recent hearings on the question of illegal occupation is how much the language of colonialism was used by countries from across the global south, including China. China used colonial domination multiple times in its speech to describe the nature of Israeli occupation. This is not insignificant. This shows that there is, you know, a lot of times when we're talking about anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism and struggles of the third world, especially in the last couple of decades, the language of anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism has more or less gone away from state discourse at the very least, and to see it in full force by really representatives of those states was quite something, and it shows that there is this still burning desire by a lot of people who fought for the right of self-determination, who fought for the right to armed resistance against colonialism in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and onwards, that they are still seeing this as an ongoing struggle, and they see the case of Palestine as part of that. That's not an insignificant development. Scholars and activists can talk about it and write about it as much as we want. It goes to another level when it's spoken at an institution like this, the International Court of Justice. So that is a significant symbolic tool that we can rely on in further pushing for Palestinian liberation, and in further calling for radical transformation of these international institutions away from the imperial world order and into a more democratic world order, where everybody is equal, where everybody has the equal right to self-determination and sovereignty. So this is a long-term struggle. I'm not naive, but it's important that we're having these conversations out in the open and very honestly like this, as we are having right now.
Thank you, Hanad, and thank you, Richard. We've got a few more questions from the online viewers. The next question: how can we end the veto power? Are there any ongoing movements focused on ending veto powers? So I think we've touched on this a few times, but not touched on how to go about ending it. Should we jump to you, Richard, then you, Hanad?
Yes, sure. There is a conference that has been given a lot of attention that's scheduled for either September or October on it's being called, I think, a summit for the future of the UN at the UN, and that definitely will table certain reform proposals, including ways of either constraining or eliminating the veto power. And it will test the degree to which these 5 veto countries that are permanent members of the Security Council are attached to their privileged status as having control over their own obligations to conform to international law. It's a test of how deeply rooted this primacy of geopolitics remains. It's, among other things, it's very out of date. These 5 powers are no longer reflective of the power structure in the world. And certainly the global south and the Islamic world are underrepresented. But one has to be skeptical that the UN, within its own framework, has the capacity to make such fundamental reforms, because any formal action is subject to what amounts to the veto, because no amendment to the charter can be made without the affirming votes of the 5 permanent members. So one has to at least entertain the prospect that with the formation of the BRICS coalition of Brazil, Russia, China, South Africa, and India, I guess, that the UN will be itself marginalized, and other coalitions will take their place, including coalitions that seek an end to this unipolar, American-led post-colonial global empire. And in many ways, the Cold War ended with the implosion of the Soviet Union and created what amounted to a power vacuum that was temporarily filled by the US, challenged a couple of years ago by Russia in the Ukraine, and challenged now ideologically by China, as Mohanad suggested in his last comment, which is really significant that China is now the most responsible geopolitical actor on the world stage. And the US is viewed in a much less favorable and positive light in the aftermath of what it's been doing with respect to Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, and sort of to build on that, there's the window for democratization from the ground up is usually very small. and if you don't get it at the right point, then you're going to be sandwiched in between two great powers that are going to do more or less the same thing when one supplants the other. What we don't want is a world order where the Americans are no longer the superpower, but they're replaced by another superpower, China or someone else, that acts in the exact same way. If that happens, then what have we actually done? I always think that the window is very small. Now, I think the window is open now, just slightly. And by now, I mean not like this year, but within a 5 or 10 year span or something like that. It's hard to predict these things. But China right now is positioning itself as something very different than the Americans. So they go to the world and go, while the Americans are doing their best to create an even bigger wedge between Saudi Arabia and Iran in order to benefit their own interests in the region, we're the ones coming in and creating harmony, relative harmony between Saudi Arabia and Iran, so that everybody benefits and everybody wins, and there's peace and prosperity in the region for everyone. And then they go to countries in Africa and they go, while the Americans are being racist to you and talking down to you, we're going to come in and talk to you like you are a respected, civilizational power that we want to work with. And again, we want to raise all boats. You can definitely critique whether China is actually doing that or not, but certainly the symbolic universe that they're advancing is one where they're the opposite of what the U.S. does. The U.S. comes in and causes strife and death and destruction in order to advance his own interests. This is true. I mean, just look at what's happening in Palestine right now. And they're coming in and saying, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to do it another way. And that over time will continue to build. I don't suspect that we've seen the last of this Chinese strategy. And it will work, in my view, as well, because people across the world, especially at this moment, are seeing the U.S. for what it is, are appalled at the U.S., are thinking of ways to get off U.S. support. That's going to be easier said than done. It's a lot of the countries in the global south are dependent on American economic support, military support, political support. So they're not going to be just able to immediately remove themselves from American influence. But I do believe that more and more countries are having these discussions internally, quietly, and consistently on how to build a different infrastructure, international infrastructure, that would no longer be dependent on U.S. and in general Western imperialism. It's very difficult to know where all of this is heading and all of that, but I do think that from our perspective on the grassroots, for people who are on the outside looking in, I'm not part of these internal discussions that are happening in the global south, or the global north for that matter. But on the grassroots, I think we should be talking about democratization. We should be talking about a different way of thinking about the United Nations or another international institution that will benefit, the majority of the world's population. These are critical conversations that we have to continue to we have to continue having on the ground up, and bringing them to the attention of our politicians wherever you are in the world. And public opinion does matter. There's this fallacy out there that public opinion only matters in democracy. That's not true. Public opinion matters everywhere. It might be limited in its ability to shape policy depending on the government and in the state structure. So I'm not trying to completely, discount the differences between open democracies and authoritarian regimes, but public opinion matters everywhere. It really does. Even autocrats and dictators still care about what their people think. So we need to have these conversations on more global levels, and the more we do that, the more we hopefully create pressure for these kinds of institutions to change. This is not going to happen overnight. It's not around the corner that the veto is going to go away, but we need to continue to push for that.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you, Richard. There's one final question from the online audience. I think this will be the last question, then we'll wrap up this evening's panel discussion. So the final question is, in the past, the ICJ has brought individuals to court. Can they do it this time by bringing Israeli army personnel instead of government? Would it be difficult due to American pressure? Would it be at all possible? And we have seen this in the past in certain cases in terms of Srebrenica. They brought in army personnel who were responsible for that genocide. And even just 2 years ago, we saw the court also put a warrant out for Vladimir Putin's arrest over the invasion of Ukraine. We have seen specific actions aimed at individuals. Would this be possible at all in terms of what Israel is committing right now in Gaza? Should we go to you, Richard, then you, Mohammed?
I'm not sure I understood the question about the accountability of the Israeli leadership for the crimes it's committed in Gaza. Is that
the question is, would it be possible to bring individuals to the ICJ for their role specifically in this genocide, whether it be army generals or members of the Israeli government?
Technically, it's not possible because the ICJ adjudicates only disputes between governments. It has there's no jurisdiction in relation to individuals. It could, in the course of its genocide finding, implicate the legal responsibility of the Israeli military and civilian leadership. But there is another institution, a parallel institution, the International Criminal Court, and it is empowered to bring such actions in response to complaints submitted by parties to its Rome Statute, which governs its operations. The difficulty with the ICC, as distinct from the ICJ, is that it has been manipulated behind the scenes by the Western geopolitical actors and has been used mainly as a policy instrument against global South governments and against adversaries of the West and has exempted Israel and Russia, Israel and the United States from accountability. There was an attempt by the Palestinian Authority, and there is now a current complaint that was initiated, I believe, by Algeria and Chile before the court, and it is seeking individual accountability. There's every reason to think that the Israeli leadership is guilty of crimes comparable to what was prosecuted at the end of World War II at Nuremberg and Tokyo against the defeated German and Japanese governments. But one notices that the crimes of the victors were not prosecuted at that time. Again, we have to be aware of this characteristic of the way world order is structured, which is to give primacy to geopolitics. And the importance of China's intrusion into the active ideological debate about geopolitics is that it's illustrating the distinction between responsible geopolitics and the kind of militarist, irresponsible geopolitics practiced by the US-led NATO coalition.
Yeah, and you know, would I like to see Benjamin Netanyahu and others behind bars? Yes. Will that bring closure and full justice for the Palestinian people? Maybe to some extent, some justice, but it's not enough on its own to prosecute individuals. What we need is a dismantling of a settler colonial structure. What we need is full rights for the Palestinian people. What we need is liberation for the Palestinian people to live as free, sovereign beings on their lands. The amount of death and destruction that the Palestinian people have endured for over 100 years is beyond the human capacity to understand and fully comprehend. We have documented it. We can and should continue to document it in terms of numbers of people killed and maimed, and homes destroyed, and building and infrastructure destroyed, and lives adversely affected, generations lost to occupation. We have all those numbers, and we should continue to do that. But when you try to really think about the actual totality of the horrors, that's impossible. Like, no human being is capable of understanding that much horror and that much suffering. And so there's no amount of legal work that can ever rectify that. It's going to take generations for the Palestinian people to heal from this. So I don't want to discount it. Like I said, I want to see some of these people behind bars, yes, but that's not enough on its own. What we need to get on the road towards healing is an end to the genocide, an end to the ongoing Nakba of the Palestinian people. Let's start there, and then start to dismantle that settler colonial structure. We have to talk about exactly what this whole center is established for: the Palestinian right of return. The land can be shared. I'm a firm believer in ideas of shared sovereignty, as opposed to this modern imperial colonial version of exclusive sovereignty that has brought such death and destruction, horrendous death and destruction across the globe, not just in Palestine. These are the tasks ahead for a real win for justice. And yes, that can be part of it, putting people behind bars. But as the professor Mahmoud Mamdani wrote about in his book, that was his critique of the International Criminal Court, is that it talks about these mass structures of violence as if they're reduced to individuals, that if you just remove those individuals, then the problem is solved. But it's not. If you remove Netanyahu and Ben Gvir now, someone else will take their place and do the exact same thing within that structure, because what is rotten is the structure, not specific individuals, as horrendous as those individuals are in their own right. That's really important to me, to always keep the question and our eyes directed towards the structures of settler colonialism and the need to dismantle them in order to achieve true justice for the Palestinian people. And that goes beyond the legal system. And that goes into things like economic justice as well, political justice. I'm in Cape Town right now as a visiting scholar. I'm seeing the effects of economic apartheid. They're significant in their effects on people's livelihoods and lives. We have to have this much larger holistic view of justice and what it means to dismantle these structures of power and colonialism and racism.
Can I make just one very brief footnote to what was just said? I think it's important for the Palestinian struggle, despite the differences, to look at the collapse of apartheid in South Africa.
Of course.
That was a case where a very entrenched racist regime experienced sufficient global solidarity pressure that it overcame the strategic interests of the Western powers that had previously sustained support for it. And I think, as I say, adapting for important differences, there's a lot to be learned for the strategies that eventually led to a transformation of the South African state.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much, Mohammed. So I'm just going to wrap up this evening's panel discussions. We have unfortunately run out of time. I just wanted to thank everyone who is tuning in currently to this online panel discussion for tuning in. Also, a massive thank you to our distinguished speakers. It was an honor to have you both join us this evening. Thank you both, Richard and Mohammed. The Palestinian Return Center has plenty of upcoming events to look out for, so please do keep watch on the Palestinian Return Center's Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you very much.